Howdy, this lecture is for the course INST 222, and it comes from the text Diversity Consciousness. We're covering communicating in a diverse world. Upon completion of this chapter, you will be able to complete the following learning outcomes. At your leisure, please review them. Our author defines communication as the process by which people transfer information, ideas, attitudes, and feelings to each other. He goes on to tell us that a symbol is anything that represents something else. Symbols can take many forms. Spoken and written words probably come to mind, but we also communicate with nonverbal symbols. Examples of nonverbal communication, or what we refer to as body language, includes gestures, facial expressions, body positioning, touching, and eye movements. The author then goes on to introduce us to this idea called kinesics. And kinesics is the study of body movements as a means of communication. He goes on to cite many different studies and researchers, and he says that by studying the kinesics of different cultures, anthropologists have determined that people from different cultures may signal each other in very different ways. He goes on to tell us that body language throughout the world is culturally specific. If a gesture is culturally specific, it may mean one thing to one culture but something quite different to another. He gives us the example of uh, President George W. Bush. He's a native of Texas, and he made a hook'em horns gesture that is well known among University of Texas fans. But unfortunately, the gesture is culturally specific and carries different meanings in other regions of the world. For example, Norwegians saw this gesture as the President of the United States making the devil sign. And for many people in Central and South America, they were shocked. To them, the president was indicating that someone's wife was unfaithful. So you can see that there is this opportunity for intercultural miscommunication to happen. He goes on to tell us, the author, that intercultural communication refers to another culture. It refers to the process in which messages created in one culture must be processed and interpreted or reinterpreted in another culture. So misunderstandings can also occur between people who may be different in a variety of ways. He goes on to tell us that miscommunication often results when we attach different meanings to the same symbol. One of the big ideas that comes from this part of the reading is that we need to understand that communication and culture interrelate. He says that culture is reflected in the way we communicate, and the way we communicate shapes our culture. Because of our upbringing, we attach specific meanings to what people say and do. He goes on to say, Butcher, in our reading, that communication styles are also different when we even talk about issues related to gender. And so when you think about how and what men and women think about and the words that they choose to express themselves, it comes out a bit differently depending on one's sex. And these are general observations. A lot of researchers have made in terms of women being more emotional in the way that they express themselves, and that men can, on average, be more rational. We also need to be aware that there are many visual forms of communication that include sign language as well. And using hand shapes and movements to talk or to express an idea is not uniform or universal. So the way that we share sign language, for example, in the United States is different in the United Kingdom and different among Chinese and the French. So sign language is cultural as well. We also need to be aware of linguistic diversity, and this refers to the many languages spoken in the United States and around the world. Some people speak only one language, while others speak more than one. We refer to people who are able to speak two languages fluently as being bilingual, and if you speak more than two languages fluently, you are referred to as multilingual. We need to be aware of this relatively new term known as linguicism, and linguicism is a form of discrimination. And we all know that discrimination equals prejudice plus power, and that power can be exercised through language or policy or an action. And there are many forms of discrimination like ableism, sexism, classism, racism. Linguicism is another form of discrimination. And we need to know that many of us are perpetrators of linguicism. The author says that you need to maybe stop and think about how you feel when you encounter a person from a different background from yourself. For example, an instructor or a teaching assistant who is bilingual and speaks English with an unfamiliar accent. Are you taken aback? Are you sometimes insulted that you may have an instructor or a teaching assistant um, who speaks another language as their first language? When you are in a group with a number of ELL or English language learner students, do you take the time to listen carefully and encourage full participation with everyone, or are you the type of person that becomes impatient? Well, these are forms of bias and prejudice, and if you act out against people who are different from yourself in terms of language, then that is discrimination. That is linguicism. And so perhaps we need to pay attention to language minorities in our classes and in our social lives as well. The author tells us that we need to pay attention to electronic communication. There's no such thing as email privacy nowadays. He tells us that technology is blurring the lines between our working and personal lives. In the workplace, employees telecommute from home or any other location, and we are using faxes, emails, cell phones, tablets, and Skyping, many different electronic forms of communication. And with that, it comes with a whole host of issues that we need to be aware of. He goes on to tell us, our author, that electronic messages may result in misunderstandings, name calling, and hard feelings. Even using all caps in an electronic message may be used by some people to express a big idea or to underline the importance of an item. But for other people, it can be a form of yelling and is not considered good netiquette. Good etiquette online. So we need to be aware of how we're communicating online as well. The author says that if we really want to work on doing better in terms of our communication, there are different areas of development that we can focus on. The first one is examining ourselves and our world. And he talks to us about material culture. And he says that material culture is that which we create and can see, touch, or feel. And he says, consider the clothes that we wear. We may not know it, but even the clothing that we wear, whether we wear expensive jeans or inexpensive jeans or an expensive watch like a Rolex or something that's inexpensive, we are communicating something about ourselves and who we are just with the material goods that we put on our persons. But we also need to know that others are sharing a bit of who they are as well. And a lot of our Muslim brothers and sisters who may wear certain types of clothing and garb, or women who may wear hijabs, they are facing a new kind of prejudice and discrimination post 9/11. And so for them, what they wear may be sending out a signal to the rest of the world that is often received with negativity. And we may need to be just a little bit more aware of how we can respect the material culture of others around us. The author recommends that we can perhaps put ourselves under a microscope and really think about how we are using language and sharing ideas and how we are thinking about and talking about others. And the author recommends that we just take the time, just to go and spend time with others, their places of worship, places that they visit, just to get to know them, because a lot of our fears are just based on plain ignorance. We just don't know anything about people who are different from ourselves. So if we take on the role of being an ethnographer, we can spend time learning with other people, and they can learn from us as well. So there is this beautiful reciprocity that can develop when we take the time to get to know people who are different from ourselves. The author says there's another area of development that we can work on. We can expand our knowledge of others and their worlds. And he asks us to consider the following questions. What do you assume about people when, for example, they converse with their faces only a few inches from you? A lot of us have these cultural understandings of what is acceptable in terms of social distance. And when people are too far away or too close on us, we make certain assumptions about them. What do we assume about people when they take a long time to answer? Do we think they're being truthful, or do we think they're being a little mischievous? We need to maybe consider all of these assumptions we make about people just based on how they behave. Do we not answer a question with a yes when some people may do that? And what does that mean? Some people are just saying yes because they want to be agreeable. It may not mean that they understand, which is a kind of cultural normativity in the United States. When people say yes, we assume that they understand, but for some cultures that just means that they're engaged. It doesn't mean that they may comprehend what you're saying. So we need to be aware of these issues. Another area of development our author talks about is stepping outside of ourselves. And he shares the example about a college student who um, talks about what it's like to let herself go and get into the inner world of another person. When you can take on the feelings and the perspective of another person, I think we call that empathy. And it's one of the 4 E's of multicultural education. And Yari, this college student, goes on to say in our text that it is one of the most active, difficult, and demanding things I do, and yet it is so worth it. And that is such a unique skill, to suspend your own ideas and for a moment to step into the world of another person. That takes courage, it takes real discipline, it can be very difficult, but it has to be a real sort of skill we work on and hone if we want to be culturally responsive professionals. I want to share with you an example of someone who did just this. And this is a young girl. Her name is Monet Davis. And she took her team all the way to the World Series of Little League Baseball. She was a pitcher, and she's done great things, so much that Disney wants to make a movie about Monet. Well, this young man who plays on a baseball team for a university actually took to Twitter and made some really foul comments about this 13-year-old girl. And he made a joke that was considered quite sexist. And because of that sexist joke, the university president dismissed him from his baseball team, and I believe from the university. Now, Monet Davis, who understands what it takes to be a really good baseball player and someone who craves uh, this sport as one's livelihood and real interest, she really felt sorry for this young man at Bloomsburg University. So she wrote a letter to the university president asking him to reconsider dismissing this young man at Bloomsburg who made this very sexist joke. And so you can imagine that she stepped into the world of Joey, this young man who made that, unfortunate comment that will haunt him the rest of his life, and which he did apologize for. But I'm so proud of Monet Davis, who at 13 decided to step into the inner world of another person and have empathy for this young man and requested that he be reinstated. And that is a lesson for all of us to learn. The author says when we want to further develop our communication skills, perhaps we need to think about how we're gauging the level of the playing field. And so he talks to us about issues of power and status. And in our reading, he defines status as one's position, and he defines power as the ability to influence people and bring about change. And so when we are communicating with people, we need to understand that often we are serving as the primary speaker and the receiver. And depending on your status or your power, it can have real influence as to whether or not people feel empowered enough to communicate back to you in a way that makes sense. And the author says that differences in power and status can be an obstacle to effective communication. With effective communication, the receiver interprets the message just as the sender intends. Those with less power are often ignored during the communication process. For example, we tend to listen and assign more importance to what an adult says than to what a child says. And so in the classroom, we want to know what the teacher thinks is important. What students say typically carries less weight. And so we have to think about issues of power and status as well. The one example of this is knowing whether or not you're in a particular cultural situation, whether on the job or whether you belong to a country where there is this difference between high and low power distance. If you take a look at the map on the right of your screen, you see that countries like Australia and the United States are considered low power distance countries. And that means that usually in our American core culture, we tend to try to value the opinion of the receiver. We try not to have these large power distances between people, for example, bosses and subordinates. But if you take a look at some other countries around the world, they do have this high power distance, for example, countries in South America and parts of Asia. And that can have a huge impact on how included or how empowered that people who don't have a certain status might feel. So another area of development our author talks about is just checking on ourselves, asking these very key questions, am I considering the entire audience? Are there other options available? What is the specific purpose of my communication? Is there an opportunity to invite feedback? How might I do things differently? We always have to consider all of these questions when we're communicating with others. Areas of development, when we think about how we communicate, there are different communication styles out there. And we know that this is one of a key areas of concern when it comes to multicultural education as well, because our communication style can set the tone for how included our students feel in our classrooms. Some of us have a very assertive style where we may just be more inclined to speak up and be more forward. Others may be more aggressive, and that tone can really be sort of distancing because it can make people, or in a classroom, make our students feel uneasy. Some of us have a very cooperative style where we invite the participation of others. And then some of us are very submissive. Think about those in your learning communities who may just be the type to just sit back and just don't want to cause any kind of trouble. So we there are several different communication styles, but an effective leader, anyone in any kind of professional setting, needs to have perhaps a combination of these communication styles, because different settings will require you to take on a different style. We also know that there are these communication skills that the author in this chapter is really pushing. If we're paying attention, we can see that these skills are highlighted throughout this chapter. You need to be able to think about what you're saying before you say it. You need to listen to what others are saying as well. You need to speak in a way that is inclusive and doesn't leave people out. And we also have to pay attention to the nonverbal communication patterns, our facial expressions, our body movements, the kinesics. These are the items that our author was talking about in the beginning of the chapter. The author says that all of these areas, the different styles and skills, need to continually develop. We need to expand our repertoire and constantly work on honing or refining these styles and skills. The author shares a really interesting study with us. When you take a look at how managers and executives are evaluating their employees and looking at what skills and competencies are considered most important during their annual review performance, ideas like critical thinking, communication skills, and collaboration and team building, these are the areas that 21st century employers are looking for. They're looking to see that you can work well on a team, you can think critically, but look where communication ranks. I mean, 80% of the managers and the employers out there are saying that they strongly agree that communication is high on their list for their employers. There are barriers to being effective in terms of communicating. Some of the barriers include, for example, your cultural biases. And the author explains to us that there is a something known as our dialect, in which we have these sort of cultural biases, these unwarranted assumptions about people. He defines dialect refers to patterns in the way that people use language. And we are familiar with this term because you can, if you pay attention, New Yorkers you have a different dialect than, let's say, Southerners. And we all are familiar with the phrase howdy or y'all. These are examples of language patterns from one region of the country that is different from other regions of the country. Now, that's a little different from accents. And he defines an accent as differences in pronunciation. So dialect refers to patterns, whereas accents refers to enunciation. Now, we have all heard the British accent, and for some reason, it's considered the more intelligent accent, the sexy accent. But that lets us know that we have these biases. As soon as we hear a certain dialect or accent, we immediately conjure up certain assumptions about people. The author goes on to tell us that we need to be aware of another barrier, and that is a lack of awareness of cultural differences. He says that if you're communicating with someone from a different culture, the two of you may interpret the same symbol differently. So the OK symbol, for example, means one thing to us, but for other cultures, it means something totally different. And we need to be aware that the lack of awareness can be a barrier to effective communication. The author also talks about language differences, like the words we use in one culture may signify something else in another culture. We refer to the image on the right of your screen in the US, we refer to it as an elevator, but in parts of the United Kingdom, elevators are referred to as lifts. So if you are not aware of these language differences as you travel abroad, it can be a barrier to effective communication. Also, ethnocentrism is considered a barrier, and our author says that ethnocentrism shows itself in the language we use when we talk about the culturally disadvantaged. What does this mean? This once commonly used term implies more than just difference. According to this label, anyone who does not share a certain way of life is assumed to be at a disadvantage. Another example of ethnocentric language is how we talk about the discovery of the United States, and we often don't use inclusive language when we're talking about Columbus's discovery of the New World. But when you talk to our Native American brothers and sisters, they will remind you that it was never discovered, that this country was always here and inhabited by the indigenous. So we need to be aware of even the language that we use. Inactive listening, our author says that poor listening skills can make it much harder to communicate across cultural boundaries. Listening intently and actively helps us to overcome misunderstandings and maximize effective communication. So, the author then goes on to tell us and warn us about microaggressions. And he says that microaggressions refer to those brief, often subtle, and unintentional biases that people communicate by virtue of what they say, what they do, and the environments they create. So we may not even be aware that we are creating hostile environments just by mere imagery. You know, for example, if we take a look at the helmets of the Washington Redskins, the mere presence of the helmets invokes a kind of discomfort for certain people of color, our Native American brothers and sisters. They're absolutely offended by the helmets and asked us to consider, what if we called the Colorado team the Colorado Caucasians, or if we called a California team the Sacramento Sikhs, and if we shared these team names in the reverse, then we would maybe come to understand how they feel as well. So we have to step outside of ourselves and put ourselves in the position of other people into their world to realize how these symbols and these images can convey these microaggressions. And we all experience them. So think about what microaggressions you've encountered in your life and how do you typically respond? If we're going to have real conversations about what offends us, we're going to have to be engaged in difficult dialogues. The Texas A&M University is attempting to do this, and they've been doing this for several years, um, and they've created a real sort of opportunity in the university space to have conversations that otherwise may be a little bit too difficult to transact. But if you're going to have difficult dialogues, the author recommends that we involve some of the following ground rules. First of all, you have to be open and honest. You have to set a tone of respect. Everybody has to come into the situation, understand that you're going to teach as well as learn. Listen, don't judge. Focus on behavior. Don't ask people to be spokespersons for their groups. There are a lot of different things we need to do when we decide to have these very difficult conversations. Communicating inclusively involves a whole lot of activities. You know, we have to listen actively. We have to keep an open mind. We have to remember to address people the way that they want to be addressed. And for example, that the term Latino is a socially constructed term created by the U.S. Census Bureau in the early 70s. And a lot of our Latino brothers and sisters come from different parts of Central and South America, and some of them don't like to be referred to as Latino. They want to be referred to based on the country that they're from, or maybe a person of color or a person with a disability may want to be referred to a certain way. And that's not being politically correct, that's just being respectful. And these are the things that we have to keep in mind. Communicating inclusively also includes, doing your research, learning about other people, avoiding slang, avoiding ethnic jokes, and don't assume that you can or should ignore differences. And we hopefully are learning that we have to recognize, acknowledge, and affirm difference, and don't be afraid to talk about it or engage in meaningful conversations. If you're going to be an effective communicator, think about the following checklist. Do you listen intently even when you disagree with other people? Some people just automatically tune others out when they're saying things that they don't necessarily agree with. Are you aware of verbal and nonverbal messages that you're sending? Do you restate, summarize, and question to promote understanding? How do you make sure your biases do not interfere with your ability to listen? So we always have to check on our biases as well. At the end of the chapter, the author shares 3 really great case studies that you should take the time to read and reflect upon. These are our learning outcomes. Thank you for your time, and gig 'em.